CBSE Board, Class 11, History, Chapter 2, Part 30, Audio by Renee Matthew. We saw about the canon of medicine, which was written by the original manuscript was written by Ibn Sina. Now we need to see more about it. The canon, actually what was the canon? It was used as a textbook in Europe where the author was known as Avicenna. Okay, so any canon which was written, the author was known as Avicenna. So just before the death of a particular person who was a scientist and a poet, you must have heard about him, Omar Khayyam, a very famous poet. He was said to be reading the canon on medicine and science, which was coined by this particular person that we saw just now, Ibn Sina. And it is said that his gold toothpick was found between the 2 pages of the chapter on metaphysics. We don't know whether it's correct, but this is the record which has come down to us over the ages. And in medieval Islamic societies, fine language and creative imagination was always propelled. It was always encouraged. It was the most appreciated and propagated qualities in a person. Fine language and creative imagination. Nothing should be monotonous. It should be different and very creative. Why fine language and creative imaginative skills were important? Because it raised a person's communication skill to the level of adab. The communication skill will rise when you have got fine language and creative imagination. Now, who is or what is adab? It's a term which implied literary and cultural refinement. So when you improve on your language skills, when you improve on creativity, you will undergo literary and cultural transformation or a refinement. Otherwise, you will not go through all these things, which is very important for the development as a learner, as a student, right? Adab forms of expressions included. Now, what is adab, or what are the forms of expression that lead to literary and cultural refinement? The forms of expression included poetry, nazm or orderly arrangement. Orderly arrangement was known as poetry, and prose that were not ordered. It was scattered words. Natra, nazm, natra. Poetry and prose. Those who study language will be very familiar with these terms. Poetry and prose. Poetry is anything which is rhyming. Prose is which is not poetry, like divided into paragraphs. Yes, it will have a different way of expression. Poetry will be usually stanzaic. It will be rhythmic. And it will have a tune, but prose, it's not necessary that it should have a rhythm. It's not that prose will not have a rhythm, but generally it is not expected that way. And these were meant to be memorized and used when the occasion arose. So everybody was expected to memorize all these things and use it whenever they could shine and whenever the occasion arose. We talked about the court arrangements, the court meetings and all that, right? The most popular poetic composition of pre-Islamic origin, very important point, was the ode. Qasida. Ode is there in English literature also. Most important one was the ode, and that was developed by the poets of the Abbasid dynasty. And mainly it was to glorify the achievement of their patrons. Patrons means people who sponsored them. It's like a sponsor where they will ask these people to go to different courts and sing. And poets usually moved from one court to another singing praises. So patrons were people who sponsored, who commissioned them. They always sang in praise of their patrons. So poets of Persian origin revitalized and reinvented. They started competing with each other. They started seeing who's better. They started memorizing, especially poets of Persian origin. They started reinventing Arabic poetry, and also at the same time, it challenged the cultural hegemony of the Arabs. The cultural style of Arabs were completely challenged. It was not the original one. It was challenged again and again when the poets of Persian origin started arising, started developing. We have a person on the screen, Abu Nawaz. He was also of Persian origin. He actually broke the old laws. He broke everything that was existing by composing classical poetry. The other poetry was totally different that the other poets practiced and sang, but Abu Nawaz composed classical poetry. Especially he started experimenting with new themes. What were the new themes? Wine, male love, with the intention of celebrating pleasures forbidden by Islam. So all the themes that were forbidden by Islam was chosen by Abu Nawaz. Okay, wine, male love, all these things. And he started expressing it in the form of classical poetry. So after Abu Nawaz, the poets addressed the object of their passion in the masculine. So masculine, that is, men will always have passion, even if the latter was a woman. They started focusing on the passion of love, masculine. So the same tradition, so after Abu Nawaz, the other poets started using this kind of strategy in their poems also. Now this tradition was followed and the Sufis glorified the intoxication. That is, people started using it more and more and they were reveled. They were facing a revelry, happiness. They were infused with this kind of idea that is intoxicating. So glorify the intoxication caused by the wine of mystical love. So they were poisoned. It is as if they were poisoned by wine of mystical love. So by this time, the Arabs conquered Iran. Okay, by the time the Arabs conquered Iran, we saw that a few slides back, that Arabs of course conquered the Iran. A language known as Pahlavi, okay, of the sacred books of ancient Iran was in decay. So Pahlavi started disintegrating. It was a language of the ancient Iran. It started slowly decomposing. There was another version of Pahlavi which was known as New Persian. Arabic was followed earlier, but now Pahlavi took a different form. It was known as New Persian and it had a huge Arabic vocabulary which soon developed. The New Persian language with the new forms of Arabic vocabulary. The formation of sultanates, Lord of sultanates started forming in Khorasan and Transoxiana. So many of them. These two places are very important. Transoxiana and Khorasan, the formation took place. And it also took New Persian to great cultural heights. So when sultanates started forming, the New Persian went to a greater level. It started developing because of this kind of change and transformation. There is one court which is known as Samanid Court. In the Samanid Court, there was a poet known as Rudaki. He was considered as the father of New Persian poetry. We saw that Persian poetry took a different form, that is Pahlavi took a different form, and the Samanid court had a poet known as Rudaki. He was the father of New Persian poetry. He started including new forms such as the short lyrical poem and the quatrain. The short lyrical poem was known as ghazal. The quatrain was known as rubai. The plural is rubaiyat. Okay? Rubaiyat. Now what is a rubai? Rubai is a 4-line stanza. Just 4 lines of stanzas will be there. 4-line stanza. In a stanza, only 4 lines will be there, in which the first 2 lines set the stage. It was like an introduction. The third is finely poised. It is divine. And the fourth delivers the point. It comes to the point in the 4th line. Very important point. There was a contrast to its form. The subject matter of the rubai is unrestricted. You cannot restrict the subject matter of the rubai. It keeps on going. Only thing is a stanza should have just 4 lines. That was the rule. It was used to express what all, the beauty of a beloved, praise a patron, express the thoughts of the philosopher. express the thoughts of the philosopher, beauty of a beloved, and praise a pattern. We are coming to Omar Khayyam, who had all the famous rubais. He reached its zenith in the hands of this particular poet and philosopher, the rubai. He is well known for this. He was also an astronomer and mathematician, but in spite of that, poetry reached its ecstasy. It excelled in the hands of Omar Khayyam. He lived at the various times in Bukhara, Samarkand and Isfahan. All these places got to know about this particular poet, and his fame started expanding. At the beginning of the 11th century, that is, this particular period, Ghazni, we saw about Ghazni earlier also, which has got a huge reservoir of many things which has come down the ages. Now Ghazni became the center of Persian literary life. Okay, it became the center where people started referring a lot of literature. The Persian literary life center was Ghazni. Poets started getting attracted to this particular place by the brilliance of the imperial court. It was like a court where all these reservoirs were collected and gathered. They used to go there and refer, the Ghazni. Alright? Okay. Rulers also started realizing the importance of patronizing art. So now people started diverting their attention to art. Still now it is not art. It was simply what? It was just religion. So now rulers understood that you have to patronize art, you have to sponsor art to get the fame. And also they understood the importance of learning for enhancing their prestige. So learned rulers always rose to prestige. So they wanted to show off their prestige. And that is why they patronized arts and also expanded their empire of learning. What about Mahmud of Ghazni? He gathered around him a group of poets. Okay, and these poets were asked to coin and compose anthologies. The name for anthology is divans, and epic poetry, matnavi. Poetry which was like a story but which had heroes in it. That is epic poetry, long forms of poetry which will have heroes and heroic dimensions of people. It will start exalting people. Suppose you take a king, it will start exalting. If it's a legendary figure, it will start exalting. And it had got a very rich language, epic poetry. So anthologies and epic poetry was widely encouraged by Mahmud of Ghazni. He had interest in expanding also this particular forms of art. He also patronized art. Anthologies and epic poetry is very important by this particular time in history of Islamic world.